Russia is throwing its weight around in British waters, NATO is begging Trump for forgiveness, and Israel is sitting at the table with Lebanon for the first time in 70 years. What's happening in the world? Let's break it down right now. Here, NATO is begging Trump to forgive them for their foolishness. Russian nuclear submarines are violating Britain's territorial waters. Every day they get closer and closer. For the first time in more than 7 decades, since around 1948, Israel and Lebanon are sitting down at the table for direct negotiations. These are the main news stories of the day. And on Saturday, direct negotiations between the U.S. and Iran are expected to begin in Islamabad, Pakistan. If you haven't subscribed yet, ladies and gentlemen, then click the bell right now so you don't miss the next episode. So subscribe and click if you haven't already. NATO is doing everything it can to fix its relationship with Trump. Here's an example of a complete turnaround by NATO. I would even call it a somersault in the air. Or as they also say, a salto mortal. An acrobatic jump with a flip, literally a deadly jump.
Has the world become safer today than it was before the war began?
Absolutely, because it's thanks to President Trump's leadership that these capabilities have been weakened. This is really, really important for your safety and mine here in the US and in Europe.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is currently in Washington, trying to smooth over the differences between President Trump and his organization. I have to say I respect what this man is doing. I generally like him, considering that he is siding with Trump and supported him in putting pressure on European countries. However, if these diplomatic efforts are not backed by real meaningful actions, through changes by Western European leaders, I would say, I am extremely skeptical about whether it will be possible to convince Trump or change his attitude toward the alliance. By the way, I think the same can be said about many Americans and Europeans. Their attitudes have already formed. There is clearly growing geopolitical friction. I'm not saying it will come to war, but America's strategic interests in the 21st century are shifting toward Asia, toward China, while Europe still wants to focus on confronting Russia. These tensions within NATO are becoming increasingly difficult to overcome. I seriously doubt that if China were to invade Taiwan tomorrow, even a single European NATO member would actually come to help. Most likely, they would limit themselves to strong statements. We've already seen plenty of such statements from Europe. So perhaps Mark Rutte's political pressure is, to some extent, forcing Europe to make concessions. However, at the same time, President Trump is quite rightfully tired of strong statements. Well, we don't need the French or British fleet if they show up after everything has already been decided. And we certainly don't need our allies voting against America in the UN. So a lot still remains up in the air. Frankly, I have my doubts that the alliance, well, even though it has existed on paper for many years, actually exists in reality. But as for whether it is actually useful to us in any way, honestly, I have my doubts. In Europe, I understand that it is useful. For us, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure if the transatlantic partnership can survive in its current form throughout this entire century. In part, this is of course regrettable, because I still believe that if NATO were a serious and effective alliance, it would benefit everyone, America as well. Undoubtedly, it's beneficial for Americans to project power around the world. This includes European military bases. If you can't use your own bases, it's the alliance with Europe that allows you to project that power. If you can't use those bases yourself, what kind of power is that? I'd say that's actually weakness. You are counting on something you don't have. Otherwise, if you knew it wasn't there, you'd think about something else. All these are questions that will have to be answered, I think, in the coming years, not too long from now. I'm not sure we'll come to final conclusions in the next few months, but the warning signs are already there, and you and I will look at both sides of this issue. Mark Rutte was heading to Washington when President Trump posted the following, and it was exactly at midnight on Truth Social. He wrote that NATO wasn't there when we needed them, and they won't be there if we need them again. And everyone knows that's true. I understand that many Europeans try to argue that NATO is technically a defensive alliance. Yes, that's correct. Article 5 was not activated. Well, of course, America wasn't attacked. Europe has no obligation to come to America's aid in the situation with Iran, even though Iran has said thousands of times that if they ever get weapons, who will they destroy? Well, first and foremost, Israel, and then the great Satan, America. But they haven't attacked, so as they say, no one was obligated. But this goes against the spirit of NATO, because there is practically an unspoken logic within the alliance when you are not obligated, but you must. Take, for example, when Clinton and NATO bombed Yugoslavia, this wasn't a matter of Article 5. It was simply that the Allies cooperated. The same applied to many others, the Middle Eastern conflict before the current one. So yes, you could say that this doesn't concern Article 5, and technically they would be right. However, that would be disingenuous, because it's obvious that this is about something completely different, not about obligations written on paper. You know, you can be business partners. There are things that are written in the contract, and then there are unwritten norms of respect, which seem to go without saying. If you break a bunch of basic norms of business behavior and then say, well, it's not in the contract, that's exactly the reason why we started all of this in the first place. You see, that's what, in my opinion, Europeans need to realize. We're not saying they're violating NATO. We're not saying they're legally obligated to do anything, but this gesture, or the lack of it, gentlemen, we took note of it. And we will remember, and keep in mind the Cold War is over. No matter how much Europe is afraid, I don't think Russia is going to invade the western part of Germany anytime soon, right? But that's not the only issue. There are plenty of reasons to believe that if China goes after Taiwan tomorrow, Europe will say, well, actually, we cooperate with China. And besides, that's not Article 5, we won't interfere. That's the real problem. If they didn't intervene here, if they not only didn't intervene, they didn't even let us use our bases on their territory. Well, in America, the whole point of NATO in the 50s was to counter the Soviet Union, but the USSR no longer exists. We're looking at a completely different chessboard, an entirely different world. So what is the functional purpose of NATO after 1991 then? Maybe there was some kind of vision. Clinton and Bush tried to implement that vision in response to the challenges of the 21st century, but obviously in reality that never happened. Starting from Trump's first term, Europeans have completely withdrawn from their own defense. Thus, after 1991, America has basically been carrying the whole burden alone. These are just things that should be taken into account, and so NATO wasn't there when we needed them. Remember that? Remember Greenland, that big, poorly managed piece of ice? A quote from President Trump. That's the whole picture. But listen to what they say next. At some point, there's a point of no return, a moment when something can no longer be done. Because when they gain access to nuclear capability, I mean the Iranians now, that's essentially the main issue. I understand that continuing negotiations to resolve something might run into problems exactly when we've already passed the point where the situation can still be settled. That's why we're getting involved now, because we're still at the point where things can still be settled. So the discussion was about the statements made by NATO officials regarding the Armutsky Strait and the attempts to find, well, how we should move forward. And then the White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, was asked about the joint statement of the NATO countries' governments. And when Karoline was asked, she said the following. She had a direct quote from the President of the United States about NATO, which she read out to everyone present. It went like this: they were tested and they failed. Do you agree that the NATO countries were tested? Yes. And they failed? Oh, yes. Becoming that power projection platform that they were supposed to be together with the United States of America. Together. The answer here is not simple. On the one hand, Trump deserves credit for how he acted in the situation with Iran. We sincerely appreciate that. We also appreciate that Mark Rutte took Trump's side on many key NATO issues. But on the other hand, Rutte is trying to prove that European leaders in general supported Trump's actions. Did you notice that? That they understood the threat? Of course, they understood the threat from Iran. They just wanted to have someone else do their dirty work. They understood that we were talking about Iranian ballistic missiles and weapons that, as they say, could be fitted with nuclear warheads, which wouldn't reach us but would reach them. But again, they didn't want to do it themselves. They wanted someone else to do it, so that, as they say, we would be in trouble and they would come out clean. They would say, "Aren't you ashamed to break the rules?" But at the same time, I just don't think that's true when it comes to most European leaders. And I'll repeat, I understand what Mark Rutte is trying to do, and I completely respect him. He's trying to show diplomacy, trying to reconcile both sides. But I have to say the following. Many European leaders have not fulfilled their commitments. For example, we have to fly around the entire continent instead of just flying over it. We have been denied access to military bases. We have essentially been condemned. France, for example, supported Iran in a key vote at the UN. Regarding the Hormuz Strait, there has been a lot of behavior that is hard to call friendly, cooperative, or supportive. Let me add more. Some figures are already taking credit for the achieved ceasefire, saying, and I quote, "We have just achieved a ceasefire." The British are saying this. To which I ask, who? Who is this we? A fly was sitting on the plowman's shoulder and said, "We were plowing." I think that's how it was, if I'm not mistaken. You did nothing. You sat idly by. You kept reminding your Islamic electoral base, which you let flood into your cities over and over again. You said the United Kingdom has nothing to do with this. No, yes, we know that very well. Even though you yourselves had to. In fact, you had to ask France and Germany for help when your own military bases were being bombed. So the relationships within the alliance are clearly not as rosy as the NATO Secretary General tries to present them, with all due respect to what he is trying to do. What will be done about these issues still remains an open question. At the same time, of course, the NATO Secretary General was asked about Trump's recent proposal, which he calls not a threat to NATO, but specifically a proposal to close at least some of the American military bases in Europe. This is a proposal, but who is this proposal for? Trump made a proposal to himself. This is happening against the backdrop of Europeans closing a significant part of their airspace to America. What's the point of that? To have military bases there if, as it turns out, they can tell you, you can't use them, you can't fly there, you can't take off from them. But if we had flown there, no one would have shot us down, right? But who would want to keep their soldiers and their weapons in a hostile country? By the way, we still largely maintain troop levels at Cold War sizes. About 184,000, I think. American soldiers are in Germany and other countries. Is this really strategically necessary, or are we doing this for someone else? Probably keeping some bases in Europe still makes sense. I'm not advocating closing them all. The argument that America needs the ability to project power around the world, in the Arctic, in other regions, still stands. So I'm not calling for completely burning all bridges with Europe, but at the same time we need to ask ourselves whether the number of troops we keep there is really necessary. Is it still necessary? When we need to act in the Middle East, we have bases there, and that's where we should act. And all this is made worse by the behavior of the Europeans themselves. The NATO Secretary General, of course, answered this question by admitting that not all European countries have fulfilled their obligations. He meant moral obligations. He diplomatically agrees with Trump that the disappointment is quite justified. But listen to what he said next.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting that the president... The Wall Street Journal reports that the president is considering punishing some NATO allies for not helping the U.S. and Israel during the war. Quote, the proposal calls for withdrawing American troops from NATO member countries that were deemed useless for military action against Iran and relocating them to countries more supportive of the U.S. military campaign. Did the president talk about this today?
Again, it was a very frank, very open discussion. He made it clear to me what he thinks about what has happened over the past couple of weeks and about his disappointment.
Some countries have outright banned the use of their bases and flying over their airspace. Spain, France.
Yes, but listen, the vast majority of European countries, including France, have done what they committed to do in such a situation. So, Europe as a platform for demonstrating the power of the United States has been fully utilized over the past 6 weeks. It's true that not all European countries have met these commitments.
Я прекрасно понимаю, что он разочарован этим.
And I think that Germany first said no, then yes, then no again. It's a similar situation with France. All right, we all understand, but that doesn't change the essence of the matter. We're very understanding, but we're not going to forgive. Guys, to be honest, you weren't particularly helpful. And not just now, not just this past week, but for the last 50 years.
Yoris, how did the meeting go? Did he say he's leaving?
Well, let me be absolutely clear. He is clearly disappointed with many NATO allies, and I understand his point of view. But at the same time, I was also able to point out the fact that the overwhelming majority of European countries have provided support with basing, logistics, overflights, as well as fulfilling their commitments. I also pointed out the positive aspects to him, but obviously it was a very frank, very open discussion, but also a conversation between two good friends.
Well, let's see, because I would like to point out the following. To the extent that any of these European countries actually gave anything to the United States, they clearly did so very reluctantly under strong pressure from Trump. And I'm not saying this to criticize their tone, that's up to them. But we need to know that this calls their reliability into question, both now and in the future. And I still believe that serious questions remain. Before NATO declares a violation of freedom of navigation, effectively acknowledging that Iran's actions violate international law, I'm very glad that someone has finally recognized this. Because we've been talking about this all along. All these countries are constantly shouting that America is violating international law, while completely ignoring the fact that Iran's actions are a violation of international law. However, if that's the case, China and Russia blocked a UN resolution that would have required Iran to open the strait and comply with that very international law. And do you know who joined them? Our closest friend, France. What is that gesture supposed to mean? And by the way, you're only saying this now because one of the proposals, not final yet, just a proposal, of the U.S.-Iran agreements includes joint patrolling, monitoring, and joint control of the strait by Iranians and Americans. And that's when you got scared. Americans will be in control. Right away, you have to say that this can't be, no, this can't be, it's a violation, right? What is that supposed to mean? When it really mattered, when the strait was actually important, you didn't come to help. You didn't take America's side. You didn't even take the side of international law. Instead, as we've already said, France, you made a secret diplomatic deal with Iran behind everyone's back so that later you could vote together with China and Russia at the UN, and in return they started treating you as an ally of the regime, the greatest obstacle to passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Well, that's just wonderful. That's how good partners act. That's the kind of partner. Partner, as soon as you turn your back, they stick a knife in it. That's a real good partner whose name is Francouz. Now, the coalition that you supposedly helped build in the United Kingdom suddenly talks about international law, about freedom of navigation. You see how some of these gestures are meaningless. They look superficial and honestly just useless. You could have intervened in the strait when it really mattered. While NATO is going through its own problems, while European armies are showing their complete helplessness and dysfunction, guess who is now, as the Americans say, eating their lunch? That is, doing whatever they want with them. None other than Russia and Vladimir Putin. I want to talk about this separately someday, maybe. But in fact, as of today, the Russian Navy is simply terrorizing the United Kingdom in international and even territorial waters. They are sending nuclear submarines, spying on British infrastructure on their ships. Apparently, submarines are even entering the English Channel. And now the Europeans are furious. Hey, Putin, this is unacceptable. Hey, Russia, what are you doing? But notice, where is our dysfunctional NATO? Because if Russia hasn't attacked, then Article 5, the fifth clause, can't be applied. Right? Yeah? They haven't attacked. NATO, which the whole world saw as a paper tiger, what are you going to do? Call America for help and say Putin is terrorizing us, what should we do? And why should America help you at this stage? You didn't come to help America, after all. It's a two-way street, ladies and gentlemen, or are you going to make some kind of diplomatic agreement with Russia to get out of this situation? Well, obviously not, because you are the biggest supporters of Ukraine in the world. And what about NATO? How can you turn to NATO now when you just ignored your only the only working active partner in this organization? That's worth talking about. And we'll come back to this topic at some point. I just want to point that out. Despite all of Europe's moral posturing about Russia, they talk about it often while also posturing against America. And if you look at the substance, Trump's actual foreign policy is much more anti-Russian than Europe's policy. They shout and they make noise. Europeans speak much more harshly about Russia than perhaps Trump does. And they want everyone to talk like that. When Biden said it, they also screamed with joy. They proclaim Ukraine's full sovereignty. We stand with Ukraine. It all sounds very interesting, but look at the reality. Every time America does something specific, let's take France as an example. They literally put up the Ukrainian flag in front of the European Union flag. I'm not making this up. That's how much they want to make their position clear and declare that they stand with Ukraine, that they are in solidarity with Ukraine, that Russia must be stopped.
But pay attention to the politics. Whenever America does something that is essentially a blow to Russia, they immediately oppose it, don't they? All they want is just to talk about Russia. As one example, the attack on Venezuela and the overthrow of Nicolas Maduro. What did we do there? We overthrew a Russian ally. What happened? European countries like Spain were outraged at us for that and hid behind international law. Iran, we know exactly how they feel about it. But let's focus on Iran. All these European countries say this. This is bad. Iran is good, and so on. All right. Iran is probably Russia's main military ally, I have to say. The vast majority of drones that Russia uses with great effect against Ukraine on the battlefield come from Iran. Of course, it's true that China is probably Russia's best economic supporter, but militarily you could argue that Iran is Russia's #1 ally. And yet, when Trump decides to say we're going to attack Russia's main ally, what does Europe do? They come out and condemn us for it, right? The same thing, by the way, applies to Cuba, which is an ally of Russia. America, or rather Trump, imposed sanctions on India's import of Russian oil. By the way, that's something Europe shouldn't forget. Despite all the statements about opposing Russia, they still secretly, through the back door, rely on Russian energy. Isn't that right? We stopped and confiscated Russian oil tankers. We won't forget that. Keir Starmer was extremely hesitant. Should this be done? Despite his anti-Russian statements. The same applies to providing Ukraine with targeting files for Russian oil refineries. And yet, at the same time, right, you'll notice that, for example, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, actually came out and thanked America for this. At the same time, we understand that he just wants more money. He knows he needs America. Okay, this could have been motivated by personal gain. But I would note that he recently made a statement indirectly criticizing France. But essentially, it was for not adopting the resolution, the UN Security Council on the Hormuz Strait. And he pointed out correctly that Iran is a country supplying Russia for the war in Ukraine. But that's very interesting. And many leftists spoke out and condemned him. How dare you say such a thing? How dare you take Trump's side? Well, he's not taking Trump's side. He's taking the side of reality. If you are truly a strong supporter of Ukraine's efforts, you should support America, which is destroying the country that supplies the drones that are now blowing up Ukraine. But notice that it's all just talk from these Europeans. Notice that this is just virtue signaling. Why is that? I would actually say that for many liberal leaders representing the establishment and supporting the status quo in Europe, like Starmer, Macron, Sanchez, Merz, all these politicians, Ukraine is really just a pretext for stoking fear, if I can put it that way, right? It's a way to unite the continent around their own failures, instead of, well, noticing the internal problems they are facing. For example, hey, don't look at the affordability crisis, the housing affordability crisis. Don't look at the failure of social programs. Don't look at the huge problem of migration and crime. It's all right-wing propaganda. Be afraid of this terrible enemy, Russia, that's knocking at our door and will invade, and we have to unite, right?
The White House confirms that Vice President J.D. Vance will lead the Kushner-Witkoff delegation to Islamabad this weekend to meet with the Iranian regime to start these new negotiations. The ceasefire seems to be holding. Iran hasn't launched any missiles today so far. Meanwhile, absolutely all corporate media are now forced to retract all the reports they aired yesterday. We got it right on this show yesterday. Somehow, we knew that the 10-point plan was fake, but all the American corporate media did not. A serious question, how is this possible? Well, the retractions have begun.
How did it happen that Ardze, Benny Johnson, and yours truly were saying that the 10 points presented as Iran's proposal were either old news or fake? I was talking about the fact that these proposals appeared. Trump said that these proposals are absolute garbage, and that a long time ago, so to speak, after looking at them, he threw them in the trash, right? And the proposals that he actually received are completely different, much less aggressive. Nevertheless, almost 100% of official TV channels and major liberal websites and newspapers said that it was exactly these 10 points that Trump named as the basis for a possible agreement with representatives of Iran. So, on one hand, there is hatred toward Trump, and on the other hand, complete misunderstanding. But today, one after another, everyone is publishing apologies, admitting that they were wrong, that they were misled. But they've already dropped a bit of poison.
And President Trump warns the Islamic Republic of Iran, American troops will not leave until the agreement is signed and fully completed. Let's begin.
Last night, the president issued a new warning to the Iranian regime on Truth Social. All American ships, aircraft, and military personnel with additional ammunition, weaponry, and everything else that is appropriate and necessary for the deadly pursuit and destruction of an already significantly weakened enemy will remain in place and around Iran until a real agreement that has actually been reached is fully implemented. This is happening as everyone watches the Strait of Hormuz. Yesterday, we learned 4 vessels passed through. Iran maintains control and states that ships passing through the strait must coordinate their actions with the Iranian military. Yesterday, Vice President J.D. Vance issued another warning to the Iranian regime at the negotiating table.
But essentially, the Iranians must take the next step, otherwise the president has many options to return to war.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, so far today there is a sense of optimism in the air. No bombs have fallen on Iran, and Iran has not launched any missiles since last night and up to today. The skies are becoming quieter in the Gulf countries as well as in Israel.
As if in the morning, an American delegation led by the vice president, including Jared Kushner and a co-representative, or he is called Special Representative Winkov, meeting in Islamabad with representatives of Iran, in order to discuss both the American plan, which was proposed in the form of 15 points, and the Iranian response, which was proposed in 10 points. We don't know what's there, but not at all the ones that the press showed us. Misled by Iranian propaganda, which it says it believed. I remind you that some representatives of the press and the Democratic Party said that they trust the official channel of the Islamic Republic of Iran more than their own president.
Iran's president writing... The president of Iran writes, "The renewed aggression of the Zionist regime against Lebanon is a blatant violation of the initial ceasefire. Such actions are evidence of deception and non-compliance, making negotiations meaningless. Our hands remain on the trigger. Iran will never abandon its Lebanese brothers and sisters." Vice President Vance made it clear that Hezbollah was never part of the ceasefire terms. They have nothing to do with you. And it would be very unwise for Iran to ruin what may be its last chance to make a deal. Pay attention to his words.
I believe this stems from a genuine misunderstanding. I think the Iranians thought the ceasefire also applied to Lebanon, but that was not the case. We never made such a promise. We never stated that it would be like that. We said that the ceasefire would focus on Iran and America's allies, both Israel and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. Basically, we're on the right track. We still have much more to do. The Iranians have more to accept in these talks, but I believe we have a strong position and will use it well.
In summary, today no bombs or missiles fell on Iran. Iran did not fire towards Israel. And apart from the military actions taking place in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, nothing else happened. Iran claims that Hezbollah is included in the ceasefire, But Israel says that this is a separate war, a separate conflict. Nevertheless, today Israel began negotiations with the leadership of Lebanon to stop the military actions. Most likely, the conversation will be about how to avoid mass civilian casualties. The thing is, Hezbollah, as is typical for Islamists, sets up its offices, communication points, headquarters, and weapon depots in areas with a large concentration of civilians, specifically so that when the Israelis start to retaliate, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or a nose for a nose, they end up hitting and killing as many women, children, and elderly people as possible, so that later they can use this for propaganda purposes. That is, unlike, say, the Jews, a certain part of the Muslim leadership easily sacrifices the lives of their fellow believers if it can help them in military or ideological struggle. On the eve of the announcement about negotiations, on April 8, Israel carried out Operation Eternal Darkness, the largest wave of airstrikes on Lebanon during the entire war, hitting more than 100 targets, gentlemen, in just 10 minutes. According to the Lebanese Civil Defense, at least 254 people were killed and 1,165 were injured. The strikes hit, as I already mentioned, densely populated areas of central Beirut without warning, just a few hours after a 2-week ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran was announced. Pakistan, which acted as a mediator in the negotiations, stated that Lebanon is included in the agreement. And Netanyahu says, "Nothing like that. This is my war, our war here." Trump later also stated that Lebanon is not included in the ceasefire. The Iranian IRGC warned that it would retaliate against Israel if, well, and so on. In other words, the negotiations were announced against the backdrop of the bloodiest day of the war. For the first time in more than 7 decades, Israel and Lebanon are sitting down at the table for direct negotiations. The two countries have technically been at war since 1948 and have no diplomatic relations. They announced the opening of a dialogue at the ambassadorial level in Washington, that is, the Israeli ambassador in Washington and the Lebanese ambassador in Washington, not a Hamadeh Mabad. At the center of the agenda are the disarmament of Hezbollah and the prospects for peaceful relations between the two countries. This breakthrough is the result of a combination of military realities and diplomatic pressure. Lebanon has been defeated, Tehran is weakened, Assad is lost, and Lebanon has found itself in a vulnerable position, seeking negotiations primarily to stop IDF strikes on its territory. Trump, for his part, asked Netanyahu to reduce the intensity of operations amid broader negotiations with Iran. Beirut, meanwhile, clearly set the boundaries. Prime Minister Salam emphasized that this is not about peace. God forbid, not at all. They would kill him. The Iranians would kill him if he talked about peace. It's only about a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli troops. I have a question for those who still have rubles in Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a personal request from me. And for those who need to receive them in dollars here in the United States of America or in any other country via a bank transfer. I need to transfer several $1,000s worth in rubles in St. Petersburg or by bank transfer. If anyone has such an opportunity, please contact me. I want you to understand that I can transfer the money legally here because it will be sent through my company. I just need to pay the artist for his work in St. Petersburg, and this is done through official invoices. If anyone needs to transfer several $1,000s in rubles over there and here, somewhere on this side of the border in a country that is not under sanctions, to receive dollars, not in cash, but by check or bank transfer, then let me know at the email address that will be listed below. Leon Weinstein, I'll list it below. Okay. Actually, I know the mood and sympathies of the Lebanese. They are 101% on whose side? Israel's. Once a group of young Lebanese told me, "We are on your side, and as soon as we free ourselves from this nightmare," well, they mean Islamism, which destroyed our country, "we will immediately become the closest friends, just as we used to be." Absolutely right. It all started with Iran, where Carter and Brzezinski helped get rid of the Shah and establish an Islamist dictatorship. And from there, the fire spread to other countries and ruined the lives of at least 2 and possibly even 3 generations of Arabs. Their grandfathers who lived in what they called Little Paris, My relatives in probably the 1940s used to take the train from Haifa to Lebanon. They told me about casinos, boutiques, little shops, piano bars, and things like that. That's exactly why Beirut got the nickname Little Paris. I'm not even talking about the brothels, of which there were even more than in Paris. Just to be clear, my family started moving to Israel from 1916 to 1920. Only my grandfather and his brother remained from the large family. My grandfather was finishing law school, and his brother was studying mechanics in Kharkiv. Then my grandfather moved to St. Petersburg for his internship. As for his brother, my great-uncle, I don't know. I don't really understand what it was called, but it was something like graduate school in Kharkiv, and he started teaching, and in a couple of years they were supposed to join their family. But by the time they both finished their studies and became specialists, the borders of the freest country in the world were already locked. That's it. Well, okay. Let's finish here. I've told you what's happening. The Chinese once said, "God forbid you are born in times of great change." Well, I don't know, if there were no changes, maybe it wouldn't be so fun, right? I mean, gentlemen, we definitely won't be bored anytime soon. It's a little scary, but not boring. That's all. Goodbye.